Hi, I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Welcome to this episode of The Briefing. Joe Biden has now confirmed he will not be running for re-election as US president. So that means we need to find out who is going to replace him. The one name that's being floated and endorsed by Biden himself is his vice president, Kamala Harris. But who is she? And does she really have a chance at beating Donald Trump? I spoke to senior political reporter for Vox, Christian Paz, to find out. Christian, thank you so much for joining us on the briefing today. Look, first things first, what chance does Kamala Harris have of beating Donald Trump?
Honestly, if we look at the polls at the moment, a little bit of a caveat, obviously there's some social science here with how people get polled about hypothetical matchups, which is, it'll take some time for the American public when they're getting asked this question to seriously think about Kamala Harris as a presidential contender. But what we see right now has been a general positive trajectory for her, where about a year ago, she was underperforming President Joe Biden in a matchup against Donald Trump. And then right before the debate and in the immediate aftermath, we saw her about evenly tied within the margin of error in a few of those national polls. And then since then, what we've seen is a general improvement from her. There are more polls that show her within the margin of error, about evenly matched up against Trump, some cases where she does better than Joe Biden does. And in some battleground states, she does significantly better than President Biden. So I'm thinking of Pennsylvania and Virginia, which was, Virginia used to be much more of a battleground state. Now it's considered one of those Democratic, solidly blue states. But because President Biden was doing so poorly, that was one of those states that was potentially in play. And so now that we see that we would have a presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, potentially, that would be one of those states that gets shored up, which is kind of what we're starting at right now, is shoring up that Democratic support.
What about generally speaking in terms of her popularity with the American people? Is she liked? Is she popular? Has she, made her mark as vice president?
Yeah, I think each of those are kind of individual questions. When it comes to the popularity side, she's not very popular, but there's a bit of a break with how unpopular President Biden is, where his unfavorability levels are much worse than they are for the vice president. Part of this is because a lot of people know her name, but they don't necessarily know what she does or who she is, maybe. Or they remember her from the Democratic primary from 2019 and 2020. And so they don't necessarily have the best impression of her. So one of the things that's theoretically working in favor for her right now is that she has an ability to reintroduce herself to the public, especially for those voters that maybe aren't as tuned in. If you're a tuned in Democratic or Republican voter, you probably have a better sense of who she is and what she's done. But the tenure so far has definitely seen her be more active and more, in the eye of the media, especially in the wake of the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US, because she's become the White House's go-to surrogate when it comes to talking about reproductive rights.
And she was, I think, the only vice president. Correct me if I'm wrong. The only vice president to visit an abortion clinic as well. So has she really made that
Yes.
her platform is women and reproductive rights?
Absolutely. That was definitely one of the things that the White House was definitely highlighting this year when she visited an abortion clinic. That was one of the things that the White House was definitely playing up, was the fact that she was almost a natural surrogate and a natural communicator when it came to talking about reproductive rights. She, in the wake of Arizona State Supreme Court passing or deciding that a nearly century-old abortion ban could be put back on the books, she immediately flew to Arizona to give a big speech about the threat of reproductive rights and of the right wing and conservative politicians' threat to reproductive rights in the US. And definitely, when it comes to reproductive rights, when it comes to voting rights, was another one of the major issues that she was assigned in 2021. And then the other thing I can think of is talking about economic opportunity and the administration's efforts to cancel student loans. She actually went on a multi-state tour for each of those issues over the last year. She was in battleground states, in Republican states. And it was another way for the White House essentially to say, we figured out what the vice president is good at, where she can fill in where the president can't, and how she can reach out to parts of the American electorate that maybe are most upset with President Biden right now.
How is she different to Biden, aside from the obvious that she's a black woman and she's 20 years younger than he is?
Yeah, I think that we can talk about this in terms of both the ideological differences between her and President Biden, and a little bit in terms of how she thinks about politics, because ideologically, she definitely falls a little bit further to the left on President Biden when it comes to issues like the war in Gaza. She was, communicated in almost like a little bit of code when she gave a big speech endorsing an immediate ceasefire a few months ago. And she really wanted political press to cover that, because this was around the time when there was a really big push to get President Biden to try to push for a ceasefire even more. And so she essentially wasn't declaring anything new, but in the way that she was speaking and some of the historical examples that she was talking about, she was essentially giving a bit of a wink and a nudge to folks further to the left on the political spectrum that she could hear, and that she didn't necessarily fully agree with the administration's policy, even though that was her job to support that. I think one of the other ways we can see a little bit of the differences ideologically here is also when it comes to talking about reproductive rights. Even President Biden, it took a really long time for him to talk and even use the term abortion, because he is Catholic and was raised in a more conservative socially, environment than maybe Vice President Harris was. And so that's one of those other spaces. And then when it comes to the way that they think about politics, she's definitely not ideological in the same way that President Biden is when it comes to his stance on neoliberalism, when it comes to almost like a Clinton style politics. It's kind of the tradition that President Biden is in. Whereas for Vice President Harris, she's always said that she is not glued to an ideology. She's very pragmatic. And this was one of the things that kind of doomed her when she ran for president the last time, because the Democratic Party wanted, forward thinkers, folks who were definitely more progressive and who could tie the policy proposals that they had together along a coherent ideological spectrum. And that wasn't necessarily what she advocated for. She talked about pragmatism, about how she was thinking about politics in the sense of how you could help more people, the biggest number of people, instead of something that pass an ideological purity test, or I think the term that she used was something that sounds like a nice sonnet. And so she's definitely somebody who you might accuse her, right? Some critics would say that she's opportunistic, or that she's calculating, or that she doesn't necessarily believe in anything. But the way that she would phrase that is, she wants to try to get as much help as quickly as possible to the greatest number of people, a bit of a utilitarian in that sense.
We saw when Hillary Clinton ran against Donald Trump, and it's not to say that this is the reason, but there was a lot of commentary after her loss that America was not ready for a female president. Do you think America is ready for not only a female president, but a black female president?
It's a really good question. And I think a lot of Democratic strategists and politicians were thinking about that in the lead up to this weekend, when it felt like there was a fever pitch in terms of President Biden's future. A lot of folks would point out that President Biden's campaign communicated that they saw their path to a second term through Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which are overwhelmingly white states and definitely skew older than the other path, which was to go through the Sun Belt states, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, which are younger and more diverse. So perhaps one of the ways to think about that question, whether the US is ready for a black female president, is to think about what constituencies she is opening back up for persuasion. And here there's both a pitch to working class folks in those Rust Belt states, and also to working class younger folks in the Sun Belt states, states that had been essentially cast aside because the polling just looked so badly for President Biden. And then there's also the question here that a lot of folks at this point may be used to seeing a woman in power, or a woman involved in politics. I'd point out that both, Michigan and Pennsylvania, and including Wisconsin, have seen powerful women both elected to the state's top office, to the gubernatorial office, or elected as senators, or have been influential in campaigning in those states. And so one of the other ways that you can kind of add on to that question is to think about who her vice presidential pick would be. And one of those has either routinely been the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, or the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. And so there's a way to try to solve for that variable there by looking at who she might pick as her vice president as well.
Yeah, so explain to us then, what is the process now? Kamala Harris has been endorsed by Joe Biden. Barack Obama put out a statement, but he did not endorse Kamala Harris in that statement. So it feels like it's far from a done deal. There's a few other names being floated around, including the governors for California, Illinois, and Michigan. If those people do decide to make a tilt for the nomination, say we've got those three plus Kamala Harris, what will that look like, and when will we know who the nominee is?
Yeah, so I'll start with the easy one. We'll definitely know who the nominee is by the end of August. The Democratic National Convention happens in Chicago in August, starting around, I believe, August 20th, August 18th, around that time, that week. And so by the end of that week, we'll know who the Democratic nominee is. Before then, what we are seeing now has been a combination of Vice President Harris and her close allies and staff making calls to influential members of Congress, to the heads of each of the influential caucuses in Congress, whether that's the Hispanic, Asian American, Black caucus. I can say the Black caucus has already endorsed her. And a particularly influential member of Congress, Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, who has been known as a kingmaker in Democratic primaries, was signaling before today and signaled today as well that he would back Kamala Harris. And then in addition to that, there are the large identity affiliated fundraising and political outreach groups. This is the Latino Victory Fund. This is the Asian American, Victory Alliance as well, who've all said that they're going to endorse Vice President Harris. And then on top of that, there have been some signs from California Governor Gavin Newsom that he said that he, said through some folks close to him that he's not necessarily looking to challenge. And in the past, Governor Gretchen Whitmer has said that she's not looking to challenge for the nomination either. I think here what's more interesting is the fight that'll be happening behind the scenes to try to secure that running mate ticket. And then moving forward with President Biden, and one other factor here is the Clintons, Bill and Hillary, have both endorsed Kamala Harris. They're moving essentially to the convention, not necessarily by coronating the vice president, but by essentially getting everybody on the same page so that when you get to the convention, you're not necessarily giving the impression that somebody's, being given this, but essentially you're beating back all the opposition in the same way that President Biden, when he announced that he was going to run for re-election, the field kind of cleared for him. So a lot of this is happening behind the scenes. And then when we get to the convention itself and back to the convention floor, President Biden, up until now, nearly, the thousands of delegates that have been pledged to him, some of them may still want to support him, but he's essentially giving them the indication that he wants them to vote for Kamala Harris. So when we actually get to the floor, there'll be less of a chaotic scene on that front because those folks will want to do what the guy who they were planning to vote for wants them to do.
It has been, I would hazard to say, the most insane run-up to an election in US politics that we've ever seen. Christian, thank you so much for joining us today and for breaking down who is Kamala Harris for us.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Well, that is it for this episode. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe and keep up to date with everything we do here at The Briefing. But also leave a comment below and let us know what you thought of this chat. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Catch you next time.